A few moments ago we talked about the removal of the needle bearings in the side cover right here, how you could use a tape chisel to knock it out if you wanted to. We also talked about the removal of the needle bearings in the main housing where we push through from the opposite side with a bearing pusher. My tool that I made up, it looks like this. Some people have used other means to make up a pusher tool. Actually sockets, half-inch drive sockets, because they step up in various steps and you might be able to find the right diameter socket. You could use something like that to push it out. Or you could use a cape chisel, a longer handled cape chisel, to push that out as well. Another thing I want to talk to you about was the removal of the roller bearing races. You saw me remove the roller bearing race that was in the steering gearbox up in this portion of the steering gearbox here by means of this special puller that I have, the snap-on blind bearing puller. Now, not many people have one of those, and there's another very good way to remove that bearing race, which is here. I've taken it out and have it set here by the side. Here's the one that we pulled out, which has a bad place on it, a little galling on it that I can catch my fingernail on. And also, here's an identical race in the adjustable end cap, one of the first things we took off earlier today. How do you get this race out of this blind hole without the use of some kind of a special puller? Many years ago, a mechanic taught me a secret that I think is wonderful, and I still use it today. This was actually back in about 1959. He showed me how you take an arc welder and you weld a bead of weld material around the face of the race that you want to remove, whether it's inside of an axle housing or in this housing or anywhere else. You run a bead of weld around there and it shrinks the race. Here's one that's been done. If you'll notice, there's a bead of weld material run around the face of the bearing all the way on the inside, and look what happens. That bearing shrinks, and I always say you just tap it on the table and it falls on the floor. Actually, when it's hot, when you've just welded it, it's very hot, you can grab this end of the thing and tap it and it'll fall right on the floor. There's one that I saved just to show you how much it has shrunk when you go around it with a bead of arc. Now, you don't damage anything. Look at the cap is perfectly good. It hasn't damaged anything, and that's a very good way to get it out of there. And all you need is the simplest little arc welder, stick welder, to do it. And you can use the same technique for the bearing race that's up inside the top of the cast iron steering gearbox by taking a piece of welding rod and bending the end of it similar to what I've done right there. Then you can reach that into the end of the steering gearbox like this, and looking through the side cover, you can run an arc right around that race, and that race will drop out of there. So this is a blind bearing race that's rather difficult to get out. It happens that even if you had a long piece of steel rod that went all the way through there, it won't remove it because you do not have access to the shoulder of the race that the rod would catch onto. It just happens that the way this thing is made inside there, a long steel rod will not engage with the race at all. It'll just slip right through the middle of it. So you have to either use a blind bearing puller like I've done there before, or the arc welding technique that I'm showing you right here would be two ways to get it out of there. Now, some people elect to leave that bearing race in place and use it again. And I'm not saying that it won't work most of the time. It probably will. But this one that we just took out a few moments ago has a noticeable pit right in it, right there. I don't know if you can see it or not. There's a little dark line, and when I run my fingernail on that, it catches significantly right on that little pit. So I would think this particular one would be a bad idea to leave it in there, because soon this will turn into running galling, and it seriously will impede the performance of the brand new parts that you've taken so much trouble to put in. I want to back up just a little bit and talk for a moment more about pulling the race out of the end cap, and perhaps even pulling the race out of the upper end of the steering gearbox, because that's a very difficult thing for a lot of people to do. I talked about using a special puller like I did when I pulled it out myself, a blind hole bearing puller. I talked about using an arc welder to run a bead of metal around it, removing it by shrinking it with heat. And there's one more method that I have used that has worked pretty well. It's called a pilot bearing puller operated by a slide hammer. This is an old, I don't know if you can still buy this thing, but you may be able to buy something that's similar to it or rent one. This is a pilot bearing tool for removing the pilot bearing on a manual transmission car or truck, the bearing that fits into the very back end of the crankshaft that helps align the clutch input shaft, or what they call the main drive gear. The input shaft on a clutch reaches through the clutch and into the pilot bearing in the rear end of the crankshaft. That's in a blind hole. So this little puller right here with these little collars around the top of it can go in through the hole of the blind pilot bearing. Turning the crank here expands them. You see they're getting wider as I crank this tool. They'll lock into the inside, and then you use the slide hammer to pull the pilot bearing out of the crankshaft. This can be used with some success on the blind races in the steering gearbox and the end cap. If you'll notice, in the end cap there are two recesses opposite one another, allowing internal puller teeth to get a grasp on it. And this kind of a tool can go in there and expand in those two spaces and get a grasp on it, and with the use of the slide hammer can pull that race out of there. That race that looks like this. So I wanted to just mention that there's that additional method. Okay, now I'm going to show you what comes in the kit from Corvette Central, which includes these small parts right here. The two needle bearings, one tall and one short. The short one fits into the side cover like this. The tall one fits into the steering gearbox where the sector shaft comes out to engage with the pitman arm. It's a little bit taller, it takes a little bit more force, so they made it a little bit bigger. These are the two roller bearings that go one above and one below the worm gear. One race in the adjustable cover, the adjustable end cap here, and one goes up inside the steering gearbox, the one that I showed you I removed with my special puller. Also, a seal. This is a sector shaft seal. Gets pressed into the side of the steering gearbox after the long needle bearing is installed. And a sector roller, a new hardened sector roller with the races already installed, and an axle shaft for the sector roller. This is a hardened and ground high quality axle shaft that I'll show you later how it goes through the pitman arm and fits into the sector roller here as an axle shaft to provide the bearing surface for this. Okay, of removing it should you have access to a tool like that. and an axle shaft for the sector roller. This is a hardened and ground high quality axle shaft that I'll show you later how it goes through the pitman arm and fits into the sector roller here as an axle shaft to provide the bearing surface for this. Okay, now we have the steering gearbox completely cleaned inside and out. Actually, I'm cheating a little bit because if you'll notice, this one's blue. The one we worked on earlier was white. I prepared this one earlier, having it all clean, dead clean on the inside and out, so I wouldn't waste a lot of time today with the cleaning of it. Everybody, I think, knows how to clean it in solvent and with the air nozzle and get everything just dead clean. I always do that. I've done it already on this one. So what we're going to do is I put this one in the jig here to hold it for us, and this is bare, ready to put together. There's no races in it. There's no upper bearing. It's bare, ready to build. All it is here is the cast iron gearbox with the mass jacket still pressed in from the factory. We'll start with the sector shaft, and we're going to disassemble the thing, take the roller out of it, because we're going to change all the parts, and we're going to put new parts from the kit into this steering gearbox. So we're going to discard this sector roller, which incidentally has a nice pit right in the middle of it, so that it will make a bump in the steering, a catch in the steering when you turn the wheel, and we don't want that. So we're going to pull this out. So the first thing we're going to do is chuck this up in my soft jaw vise so as not to damage the sector shaft. I always seem to like to use these swing sockets, flexible sockets. This is 5/8 wrench size on both sides of this, so I put my